Hello, welcome to the Free Exchange, hosted by Lindenwood University's Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise. Today we're here with Carey Roberts, who is a historian from Liberty University and a fellow at the Liberty and Ethics Center, one of the three focus centers of the Hammond Institute. Welcome, Carey.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Rachel. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, love listening to your southern accent up here in the, I guess we're not the north quite, but
I can talk all day long.
That's great, great. So today I thought that I would get our audience some background on you by asking you about the way that your research has evolved over the years. And I know that you are a Jefferson scholar. Is that what your dissertation was about?
It is, and the accent that you're picking on me about plays a pretty critical role in my own history as a scholar. I lived overseas for a year in a study abroad program, and while I was there, I was really on a track to try and go into the Foreign Service. I was focusing on international relations, international studies, and I noticed that people kept having me talk. And they were even recording my discussions without me knowing it, just so they could hear my accent. And that made me start to wonder, why was I so different? Where did this accent come from? I didn't think I had an accent. I thought I sounded like everybody else. And it was that led me away from international studies and international relations to the study of history. So I started studying Southern history, and one step led to another.
And you're originally from Mississippi?
That's correct. I'm from South Mississippi, I am.
And because of course, Southern accents differ from place to place, and so you would be called Deep Mississippi? Or?
I'm not really sure, because I did live in South Carolina for a while, so I kind of have a little bit of a mixture of a Southern accent.
Oh, gotcha.
It's not Appalachian, it's not Tidewater, it's not backwoods too much, I would think.
So why Jefferson in particular?
Well, that's for my study of history. I was attracted to the founding era. I really liked the framers. I was raised in a culture that really appreciated the founding of the Republic, appreciated the principles of the founding, even if we didn't quite know what those principles were.
Okay.
And so it was a natural attraction to me. I actually started off wanting to study the American South after the Civil War. I wanted to write something in intellectual history of that period of time.
The Reconstruction era.
Exactly, into the 1880s and 1890s, and then gradually I was attracted more and more back to the founding era, the Revolutionary War era. It's also trying to locate origins of these things that I wanted to study in the postbellum period. And I never went back to those things. I stayed really in the 18th century.
Oh, okay. So you really are an intellectual historian?
Right.
Is that okay?
Right.
And so what was the thesis of your dissertation?
Well, my argument was looking at the Jeffersonian Republicans and how they interacted with the Federalists in the 1790s.
Okay.
And I looked at it from the standpoint of the Constitution being an experimental document. It's an experimental phase in the 1790s. What were the arguments for and against the Constitution, and when did that experimental phase really end? And what I learned was that it really ended not with George Washington, not with John Adams, not with the Federalists. It really ended when the Republicans won control of Congress and Jefferson was ultimately elected to be president. So it was the Jeffersonians who ended the experimental phase of the Constitution.
Meaning that it was fully established.
Exactly.
It was accepted. We weren't going to deviate and go with another
Yeah, that's true,
government.
but it was accepted on their terms. It was not accepted on the terms of more of a nationalistic focus that the Federalists had promoted during the previous decade.
Right, and of course that changes later in the game, but you have that for a period of time. And so you use the word experimental, I noticed, and that comes up a lot in your work. So for instance, you talk about the arrival of the various settlers. You've talked about that here at Lindenwood before, and the sense in which, although they may have had very specific goals, it ended up turning into an experiment. Can you talk to us about that?
That's right. If we look carefully at all the major European settlements in British North America, but we could also look at Russian North America and what we now call Alaska, or we could look at Swedish North America or Dutch North America. almost all of those settlers had a unique vision of social order which they wanted to bring to the New World and impose upon their colony.
Right.
And every one of those failed. And so what I like to argue is that the origin of American liberty is not in the success of settlement, because so many of those original visions failed, but instead the source of our liberty is really in the failure to impose that unilateral social order from the top upon the people who came here.
Now, that's a bit of a departure from the way that it's often told. Have you run into friction with other historians over the way that you're presenting this? Because you're presenting it as a kind of spontaneous, almost accidental process that we end up with the freedoms we have, as opposed to an account where we account for it as being intended.
Yes, there are other interpretations, some of which will emphasize a steady development of certain political or ideological principles over the course of Western civilization, and they were sort of plopped down in North America. There are others who emphasize the importance of religious thought, which was very important for the colonial settlers.
Yeah.
But they treat it more or less as a single religious or single Christian tradition, even a single Protestant tradition,
right,
that was sort of plopped down in North America. And then there are those who see really North American colonization as a story of exploitation, a story of slavery, a story in which these very hard ideas were imposed upon both the native and the settling populations. I tend to differ from all of those.
I'd like to talk about each of those if we could. The first one struck me.
I have to remember them.
Okay. Yeah, the first one about ideology struck me because as a philosopher, I think we tend to look at history entirely as a matter of ideas and the progression of ideas. But historians always correct us, and since I studied Hume, who was both a philosopher and a historian, he's a bit more correct, I think, on this point, in focusing on the material circumstances that make such a difference in the way that things progress. And so I wonder if that's what's on your mind in your critique of the first account.
Yeah, I think that ultimately what happens in British North America by the time we reach the French and Indian War is that you have in place a very diverse, decentralized society. It's almost a continent of a myriad of parallel societies coexisting in the same territory. And as a result of that, it made that area fertile ground for ideologies which were conducive to protecting that kind of society. A society based on communal and individual liberty, a society that rejected arbitrary and artificial efforts to impose order. And what I think is most critical is that it was a group of people who did not live as if any single institution exercised absolute authority over their lives.
And is that why you sometimes describe early America as medieval in a certain way?
Sure, in many ways it is. And that's something that I think a lot of scholars and probably a lot of Americans are uncomfortable with.
It sounds foreign.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean, we want to think of the United States as the most advanced country in the world, or certainly a country that's on the cutting edge of progress. That's something that is almost inbred within our mental capacities now. We think of the United States as synonymous with progress.
Right.
Technological, religious, economic, political progress. But in fact, if we think of the United States as a society in which there was no real sovereign institution, because of the frontier, because of the diversity of the cultural groups that existed in colonial North America, because of religious freedoms that were granted to people, because of our institutions of federalism, competition between the federal and state governments. I can go on and on and on.
Right.
If we think of it in those terms, the United States looks a little more like medieval Europe than it does even like modern Europe, where there is an emphasis on sovereignty, and sovereignty being one person, one group, or one institution, like the modern state, exercises sovereignty over all other things.
It's interesting to me how you make this point about progress. And Americans, we might argue that their medieval nature led to their progress insofar as the entrepreneurial spirit and inventiveness. And there's a lot of talk about the way that you can fail in America, but you can't fail too badly, right? So you can get back up and fail again until you succeed. So it's like we achieved it indirectly instead of having a central governor getting us to the progressive end. We achieved being, I mean, we are the country that invented the microchip, right?
Oh,
I mean,
exactly.
that's true.
Exactly. And if we think about all the major inventions in American society for which we still benefit today, most of those things have their origin in the decentralized society of the United States before the American Civil War. Even the coding that we use for computer technology today, the on-off codes of ones and zeros, that's of course rooted in the telegraph. Railroads and our transportation improvements, early branding, early forms of well, we might be stretching it to say department stores, but local stores and local culture producing vibrant enterprises, which people in other parts of the country want to mimic and they copy. And that's really the story of American capitalism. And it's something that's rooted not in 20th century efforts to regulate that economy. It's something that existed in a time of much greater freedom.
Now, of course, in a way, we could contrast it with medieval society there because we have the guild system and so forth that's limiting the development of capital markets in medieval society. So when we say there's something medieval about it, I suppose we're just talking about the decentralized nature of the political system?
Sure, but there's also another connection. If we were to go back and look at the years in the early republic, you have intense competition between states trying to further capitalist development. Americans really have no genuine socialist tradition. We have no tradition in which people stand before economic development and say no more.
I'm going to stop you right there. We're going to take a quick break, and then I want to pick up right where we left off when we come back. Thanks, Carey.
Good.
In 1977, in Johannesburg, South Africa, an 8-year-old boy picked up the game of golf from his father. By the age of 9, he was already out playing him. The odds of this gentle lad winning the Junior World Golf Championships at the age of 14, 1 in 16 million. The odds of that same boy then making it to the US and European Pro Golf Tours, 1 in 7 million. The odds of the Big Easy winning the Open Championship once and the US Open Championship twice, 1 in 780 million. The odds of this professional golfer having a child diagnosed with autism, 1 in 88. Ernie Els encourages you to learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs. Early diagnosis can make a lifetime of difference.
Hi, welcome back to the Free Exchange, hosted by the Hammond Institute at Lindenwood University. We're back with Carey Roberts, a historian from Liberty University, and we were talking about the way that you sort of depart from some of the usual approaches to early American history. And you were saying that America has no real socialist tradition. I mean, I think of some of our utopian attempts, right? Some of those little, what were they called? New Harmony or something like that?
Utopian communities.
Yeah, utopian communities. So tell me why you don't think that we have our own real socialist tradition.
Most of those things related to utopian communities were efforts to mimic what was going on in Europe at that time. There was no real indigenous socialist movement trying to stop economic progress. And we even have socialist political parties that are active at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And at one point, they actually came pretty close, sort of. But nonetheless, we really don't have a powerful socialist movement like you might see in other parts of the world today. Instead, what the United States has in its tradition is competition between those who want to embrace slow, steady market development and those who want to hasten that development, who want to speed it up.
Yes.
We don't really have anyone out there who wants to slow it down. Now, you do have that in a little bit in environmental and conservation movements in the 20th century. But by and large, over our history, that's not been the case. Even in the colonial period, people were most anxious to use political institutions to speed up economic development.
Central planning to help free markets.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, now you mentioned two other strands of thought. One emphasizes religion, but you said perhaps in a way that's overly unitary in its approach?
That's right. I think there is a sense among many Americans that the Christians who came and populated North America were of a similar, and in some cases maybe even the same faith, when in fact the religious groups were fairly diverse from each other. You have Roman Catholics who were settling key colonies like Maryland. You have Anglicans who are settling many of the southern colonies. You have Puritans and Pilgrims, which were two different groups, but settling Massachusetts Bay. Dutch Reformed Christians in New York. French Huguenots, which were French Calvinists, settling South Carolina. Right. So it was a very diverse group of people who may have agreed on some things, but they actually disagreed on some pretty fundamental points.
Well, Quakers were sometimes tortured and maybe killed. I don't know if they were killed, but I know that they were treated very badly sometimes by some of the other groups considered, heretics, right?
Right. They were certainly treated that way in Great Britain. And so when those folks migrated to North America, they wanted to make certain that the liberty of religion was rooted in liberty of conscience. And it took time to achieve this. It took many generations for all Americans to realize this importance. We have to understand that in the 18th century, the idea that you didn't have the state supporting religious devotion or encouraging religious devotion, that was alien.
It would be a recipe for chaos, maybe, in people's minds. Yeah.
Absolutely. The insistence was by learned people in Europe especially, was that if we were going to have religious devotion, if religion was going to flourish, it needed to have state support and control.
Right.
But because of that tension between those different religious groups, nobody wanted the other to have the potential of using political power against them. And so it was really what came together in our First Amendment. And what the First Amendment ultimately did was that it eliminated any institution from exercising religious sovereignty. Right. No religious denomination, no established church, no states, nor the federal government or Congress.
I always think of Voltaire's quote about the Europeans having two religions and killing each other, and Americans having 30 and getting along great.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
The diversity was encouraged by the...
Sure. And some states did maintain established churches for a couple of more generations. But what was the result of all of this? It wasn't chaos. It wasn't infidelity. The United States became one of the most religious countries in Western civilization, and is still one of the most religious countries in the modern world.
Well, and Hume noticed that if you want to control the priesthood, you should put them in the pay of the state. So he knew that would end up leading to really the control of the religion, not the flourishing of the organic faith.
If you want to ruin anything, let the government encourage it.
That's right. Okay, so in that account, you depart from the notion that we're really, I think of the Supreme Court justice who said America's a Christian nation, right, in that famous case in the 19th century that's often referred to. And so there's this notion, I think, that we have as a kind of national myth that we're one unitary body coming in and settling for religious freedom. And you're telling a much more complicated story. Now, in a globalized world where we're dealing with all sorts of religions and worldviews, are people simply putting all of these different forms of Christianity together into a soup because we're having to make bigger distinctions now, and so we're losing the finer distinctions that would belong to one major religion? Is that what's going on, or why are we not interested in the subtler differences between these various groups? Because some of them are quite intense gaps in belief.
I think that's an excellent question. I can't answer it completely. My guess is it has something to do with what American Christians want to say about themselves. There are broad movements across various planes of American Christianity emphasizing interdenominational unity, emphasizing downplaying the importance of doctrinal differences. Part of this has to do with an emphasis on evangelism and the thought that if we have great differences among ourselves, that the rest of the world will not be willing to embrace Christianity. And it's this whole emphasis on unity. I mean, it's really a legacy in some ways of the ideology of nationalism. What I suggest, though, is that as the modern world begins to fall apart, those ideologies that support that modern world are also going to fall apart. So I think in time, perhaps even in my lifetime, you'll see American Christians gain a greater appreciation for that diversity and the richness that it offers.
Is there a middle ground between wanting to harshly differentiate yourself from other groups and living together in a way that allows for you to benefit from one another's strengths? I mean, I guess that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's certainly a number of people who are very dour about the future of America.
Yes.
Because they deplore the collapse of what they think should be a unitary culture. And they insist that for a country to be great or a country to even survive, it needs to have one common moral center. But the real history of the United States shows that we are a country with no common moral center. Instead, as I said earlier, we're a country of countless parallel societies, each with their own moral center. Now, that's not a recipe for cultural relativism.
Right.
Because for cultural relativists, there is no moral center at all.
Okay, right.
But I think in terms of each community, each association, each little parallel society, they all have those moral centers. And as Americans, we have to learn to balance those.
And they can be in conversation with one another.
Absolutely.
I think so. They're not falling down the relativist rabbit hole where we kind of have nothing left. I have my subjective reality and you have yours.
Right.
And so what would the conversation be about?
Exactly. And as you know, on a daily basis, you and I as Americans, we have to navigate those different moral centers.
Right.
We have to wake up and ask ourselves, all right, who's going to claim my allegiance today? Is it going to be my kids? Will it be my church? Will it be my employer? Will it be my boss? Will it be the store in which I'm going to buy groceries?
Right.
Who's going to command that? And we have to learn how to navigate all those different channels and put order to them. That's an incredibly difficult thing for people to do in the modern world. But Americans have figured it out.
We do it. We do it. Now, what about this story of exploitation? Because that's certainly dominant in academia. And I think that the focus on the story of exploitation has had a certain purifying effect, because you do have terrible oppression that has gone on in history. And so, how can you depart from that view without downplaying the evil of some of the oppression that's really occurred?
That's right. Well, as a historian, I do believe that my responsibility is teaching people to learn to tolerate their past. There's a lot of evil in our past. There's going to be a lot of evil in our future. We're not going to get rid of that. That doesn't mean we accept those acts of oppression. It doesn't mean that we ignore those acts of oppression, nor does it mean we minimize the importance of those acts of oppression. But we have to recognize that there is a such thing as human nature.
Right.
And that nature is not perfectible. So in the same way that, I'll go back to Jefferson.
Okay.
To sum up Jefferson's views of education, he believed that a person should be educated to a point of humility. They should learn enough to realize how little they know.
Very Socratic.
Now, as a father of teenage sons, I'm beginning to realize more deeply the importance of that perspective, and I'm sure you will too.
Yes,
in
coming
a
soon.
few years. But they will learn those things. They will learn that they don't know everything. So when it comes to understanding those acts of oppression in our past, it's a way of granting to us humility. And I think this emphasis on exploitation has also had a positive impact on challenging nationalistic assumptions.
Good point.
About ourselves.
Sure. Think of the Dred Scott case, right? Overturned
exactly.
by the federal government.
Exactly. In St. Louis.
Yes, that's right.
It really started here. Slavery was an American problem.
Right.
It was not just a Southern problem. Racism was and is an American problem.
Yeah, very, very bad in the North, northern cities right now, for sure. Right.
Americans have a hard time dealing with ourselves in these terms, but I have to admit there is a real danger in this attitude of tearing everything down in our past, because we forget that there's a whole lot to love and appreciate and be thankful for.
Yeah, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
Sure.
I think we are sort of on the verge of losing that in many universities and colleges.
Well, and a point that our colleague Don Livingston makes, which I really like, is that, for instance, in the history of the South, the Southern culture doesn't just belong to white people, right? There's a black Southern culture. And so if we tear down Southern culture, we're tearing it down for every member of the South. And we have to make subtler distinctions.
Right, and there's a Creole culture in the South.
Right,
There's a Native American culture in the South.
Good.
My family has very strong connections to Native American culture over many generations. But, but to avoid tearing those things down doesn't mean we have to accept ourselves as being all the same either. So I think it's important to understand that richness.
Balance. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. And thank you all for being with us at the Free Exchange hosted by the Hammond Institute at Lindenwood University.